I accidentally spilled wine on my sister-in-law's wedding dress and she slapped me in the face. Then my husband kicked me out of her party. My first mistake that night was pretending I felt comfortable walking into that house at all. Like my stomach was not already doing that slow, nervous flip it always did when we pulled up to my mother-in-law's place, and I saw all the cars lined up in the driveway and along the street, like a warning line of metal saying, "Hey, remember, you are outnumbered in there." My husband was humming along to some song on the radio, tapping the steering wheel like this was any regular family dinner, and I sat there smoothing my dress over my legs, pretending I did not feel like I was walking into a performance where everyone had already decided I was the wrong actress for the role. I kept telling myself it was just one evening, just a few hours, just a plate of food and some forced laughter. And then we could go home. Except home lately meant a place where I was always a little tense, waiting for the next snide comment to turn into a full argument. My name is Lana, and we live in the US, not far from my parents and just close enough to his family that I never really got a break from them. By the time we were knocking on the door, I had already done that thing where you rehearse tiny reactions in your head, like how hard to smile if my sister-in-law hugged me, what to say if my mother-in-law made one of those jokes about how her son used to like his food cooked before he got married, and how to keep my voice even if someone asked when we were finally going to have a baby. I know that sounds dramatic, but if you have ever walked into a room where you know you are the one on probation, you get it. Your whole body goes into this weird performance mode. My husband squeezed my shoulder with what I'm sure he thought was a reassuring gesture and said, "It's going to be fine." And I remember thinking, easy for you to say? You're the golden child in there. You could set the living room on fire, and your mother would probably blame the lighter. His mother opened the door with that big smile that never fully reached her eyes when it came to me, and she pulled him in for a hug first, obviously, loud, "My boy," and all, then turned to me with a smaller, more measured smile, like she was checking a box on some invisible form. "Lana, you made it," she said, as if I had been invited to a corporate meeting instead of dinner. And I forced my own smile, hugged her back, breathed in her strong perfume, and told myself to exhale slowly so I would not choke on the scent and on my irritation at the same time. The house smelled like food and cleaning products and that faint hint of something floral she always had going in some plug-in in the hallway. The dining table was already set, way more plates than usual because my sister-in-law and her husband were there, plus a couple of cousins I barely knew but who somehow knew everything about our marriage from the way they looked at me sometimes. My sister-in-law was already in the living room when we walked in, perched on the couch in this very white dress that clung to her like it had been sewn onto her body, laughing at something her husband said. She stood up when she saw us, smoothed the dress like she was in a commercial, and walked over with that air she had that always said, "I live in a different tax bracket from you now, but I'm pretending we're the same for today." "Hey," she said, leaning in for a kiss on the cheek that somehow managed to feel like an inspection. "You look nice." It was the pause that did it, the little micro-hesitation that said she was surprised I had managed to look presentable. I told her she looked nice too, which was objectively true, and I tried very hard not to picture spilling anything on that perfect white fabric, because I have a bad habit of thinking about the worst-case scenario like my brain is doing its own dark comedy show in the background. Dinner itself started out almost peaceful, if you did not count the small digs. My mother-in-law complimented the way my sister-in-law had arranged the salad like it was an art installation, and then glanced at me when she said, "Some people are just naturally good at making things look elegant. You know?" I laughed it off, because that is what I do, swallowed the urge to say something back and instead focused on not dropping my fork, not clinking my glass too loud, not existing too much. My husband went quiet the way he always did around his family, shrinking into this softer version of himself that said, "Please nobody fight. Please nobody make me choose." We made small talk about work, which for me meant explaining again that being an administrative assistant at a medical office is not just answering phones. And then my mother-in-law asked if things were still tight for us, money-wise, in that fake, innocent tone. I told her we were managing, which was true in a very loose sense, and she turned to her daughter and said something about how lucky she was that her husband took such good financial care of her, like my husband was not sitting right there, working full-time too. After we ate, someone put on music in the living room, because apparently we were turning the whole thing into a mini party, and a few of the cousins started dancing. Drinks were poured, and I accepted a glass of red wine because if I was going to survive this night, I needed the social lubrication. I am not a big drinker, but one glass usually takes the edge off the constant analyzing every word I say. The living room slowly turned into this cramped, loud space full of bodies and laughter, and those high-pitched shrieks some people emit when they are tipsy and trying to sound like they are having the best time of their lives. I stayed near the edge of the room with my glass, swaying a little to the music, trying not to call too much attention to myself. I did not realize my sister-in-law had moved behind me until much later, which is the part that people love to pick apart. Like, well, why didn't you see her there? As if I had eyes in the back of my head and a little radar for white polyester. I was mid-conversation with one of the cousins about some show she was watching when someone in the crowded living room brushed past me hard enough from the side that I instinctively stepped back to keep my balance. That tiny automatic step, plus the music and how packed the room was, put me exactly in the wrong place at the wrong time, without me even realizing she was right behind me. That tiny step, plus the music and the crowd and my total lack of spatial awareness in that house, was all it took. My elbow jerked, my glass tipped, and in what felt like slow motion, I watched this deep red arc of wine fly out of the cup and land straight across my sister-in-law's chest and stomach, soaking her perfect white dress in ugly stains that spread like ink. For a second, there was silence in my head, like the sound had been turned off. And then she started screaming like I had done it on purpose to humiliate her, instead of accidentally baptizing her dress in Merlot. Conversation stopped. Music kept playing, which made it even worse, this upbeat song in the background, while she stared down at herself, eyes huge, mouth open, hands hovering in front of her like she was afraid to touch anything. "Oh my God, look at what you did," she shouted, and every face in the room turned toward us. My heart slammed against my ribs, and my first instinct was to apologize, obviously, because it had been an accident. "I am so sorry," I said, already reaching for napkins from the coffee table, already dabbing at the fabric, babbling about how I had not seen her there, how someone had bumped me. My husband moved in from somewhere, taking the empty glass out of my hand and grabbing a handful of napkins too, his face stuck in that tight, embarrassed half-smile he gets when he wants the ground to swallow him. She slapped my hands away. "Do not touch me," she snapped, which is hilarious because technically she said that while already touching my wrists, but I was too stunned to process the irony. "This dress is ruined. Do you have any idea how much this cost?" Her voice climbed with each word, like she was trying to hit the ceiling, and I swear I felt myself shrinking every time she looked at me like I was some clumsy child. I kept apologizing, because that is my default setting, and tried to explain again that I did not see her behind me, that someone pushed into me, that it was crowded, that it was just wine on a dress. I made what I thought was a small, disarming joke, because that is my second default setting, something like, "I promise I do not usually need eyes in the back of my head, but maybe I should install some." And I guess I should have just stapled my mouth shut because my husband let out this tiny nervous laugh and that was it. That was the spark to the gasoline. Her face went from angry to volcanic. "You think this is funny?" she yelled, stepping closer, the smell of wine and perfume hitting me all at once. "You ruin my dress and then crack jokes? Of course you do not get it. You could never afford something like this even if you worked your little office job for a year." There it was. The money thing, the class thing, the way she loved to remind me that her husband made more in a month than we did in several. I could feel my ears burning, my throat closing, and still I tried to calm her down, telling her again that I was sorry, offering to pay for cleaning, for a new dress, anything. People were staring, some pretending not to, which honestly made it worse. My mother-in-law rushed over, hands flying to her daughter's shoulders, cooing and fussing like she had just witnessed an actual crime scene. "Honey, it is okay. It is just a dress," she said, except her eyes shot me this cold, hard look that said the exact opposite. The insults kept coming, little jabs about how careless I was, how I never paid attention, how her brother had always dated women with more grace. I felt each one like a little slap, and then she gave me a real one. She lifted her hand and, without warning, swung it across my face, the sound of it sharper and louder than I would have thought possible. My cheek exploded in heat, my head snapped to the side, and for a heartbeat the whole room went into this stunned silence, even over the music. I wish I could tell you I handled it with saint-like calm, that I turned the other cheek, literally, that I walked away with dignity. I did not. What actually happened is that something inside me, something that had been stretched thin since the day I joined that family, finally snapped. All the little comments, the snubs, the being left out of photos, the jokes about my job, the way my husband never fully stepped in, they all boiled up at once. Before I even fully realized what I was doing, my hand came up and I slapped her back. It was not a light tap either. It was a full, ungraceful, furious slap that landed right on the same spot where my wine had hit earlier, except this time it was skin and not fabric. Her head jerked to the side, her mouth forming this shocked O shape, and the room went from stunned to horrified in one breath. Someone gasped. 2 people lunged in at the same time. Not to protect me, of course, but to physically stop me from supposedly making a scene. My husband said my name like I had just thrown a baby out a window, and my mother-in-law rushed between us like I was some wild animal she needed to protect her precious daughter from. "What is wrong with you?" My mother-in-law yelled at me, checking her daughter's face with dramatic little pats. "You hit her! You actually hit her!" She said it like I had attacked her out of nowhere, like we were all just standing around being polite, and I had suddenly decided to commit violence for fun. My cheek still throbbed where her daughter had hit me first, but nobody seemed particularly concerned about that. My sister-in-law started crying, big noisy sobs that sounded theatrical even through her very real anger, and she kept repeating, "She hit me back. She hit me," like she was the victim of a one-sided attack. My father-in-law hurried in with a bag of ice from the kitchen, telling her to hold it against her face, while shooting me a look that could have burned a hole through the floor. My husband finally stepped fully into the circle, but not on my side. "Lana, what were you thinking?" he asked, voice low and furious, like I was a kid who had misbehaved in public. "You cannot just put your hands on my sister like that." I stared at him, honestly amazed, and said, "She slapped me first," one hand still pressed to my stinging cheek. But it was like that detail had been erased from everyone's memory. My sister-in-law, clutching the ice to her face, still sobbed about her dress, about how expensive it was, about how I had ruined her night, her outfit, her mood. My mother-in-law kept muttering about disrespect, and in my house, and after everything we have done for you, which, by the way, is hilarious because the list of things they had done for me was very short and mostly involved criticizing my cooking. At some point, she straightened up, turned her body toward me in this very deliberate way, and said, "You need to leave." It took me a second to process that she was talking to me and not her own child who had slapped a guest first. But no, the villain of the evening had apparently been decided. "You cannot stay here after that," she added, voice shaking with outrage. "You assaulted my daughter." I opened my mouth to argue, to point out the extremely obvious fact that her daughter had hit me first. But my husband's hand was on my arm now, fingers tightening, and he whispered, "Maybe you should just go, okay? You made things worse." That sentence, more than the slap, more than the screaming, more than the icy stares from a room full of people who did not actually know me, is the one that really lodged in my chest. I swallowed hard, nodded, because I could see there was no version of this night where anyone suddenly turned around and said, "Wait, that was not fair to Lana." I grabbed my bag from the chair near the wall, my face burning, my chest tight, and walked out while people whispered behind their hands like we were in some bad soap opera. On the porch, the air felt colder than it had when we came in, or maybe that was just the adrenaline dropping. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and ordered a ride through an app, my fingers moving on autopilot while my brain replayed the last 10 minutes on a loop. I checked my cheek in the front camera and saw a faint red mark, which somehow made me angrier, like my skin should at least show the full damage if everyone was going to act like I had started a war. The ride showed up in a few minutes, and I slid into the back seat, told the driver my address, and stared out the window as the house shrank in the side mirror. My husband did not follow me out. He did not call after me. He stayed in there with his crying sister and his furious mother and his father, who was acting like the dress had been a family heirloom soaked in blood instead of fabric covered in wine. On the way home, my mind did what it always does when something huge blows up. It started pulling up old files from the brain archive. Like the first time I met his family and his sister had grilled me about my job, asking how long I planned to stay in a position like that and if I had real ambitions. Like the holiday dinner where my mother-in-law had made a comment about how lucky my husband was that I at least tried in the kitchen because his previous girlfriend just ordered takeout, and the room had laughed even though I knew she did not mean it as a compliment to me or to the other woman. I thought about the anniversary when I had saved up to take my husband to this nice little place in town and his sister had called halfway through dessert, asking him to come pick her up because her car had decided to die, and he had left, apologizing to me as he walked out, leaving me alone with a half-eaten slice of cake. When I had told him later that it hurt, he had said, "You know how she is? She needed me." Like my need for one uninterrupted night did not count. By the time I got back to our apartment, my head was pounding. I kicked off my shoes, dropped my bag on the couch, and stood in the middle of the living room, suddenly unsure what to do with my hands, my face, my entire life. I went to the bathroom, washed my face, tried not to cry, failed, did that ugly crying thing where you have to grip the sink to stay standing. I kept hearing the slap in my head, the sound of it, the way the room had gone quiet, and I honestly did not know if I regretted it or not. Part of me did, because I knew it gave them ammunition. Part of me did not at all, because it was the first time I had ever physically pushed back against any of them. My husband did not come home that night. At first, I checked the time obsessively, telling myself he was just helping calm things down, that he would walk through the door any minute with some lame joke about how his family had overreacted. Then it got later and later, and the hope turned into this solid, cold thing in my chest. When my phone finally buzzed, around the time I would usually be brushing my teeth and scrolling aimlessly before bed, it was a voice message from him. I stared at the screen when I saw it, thumb hovering over play. I did not want to hear his voice say something I could not unhear. But of course I listened, because I am me, and I always listen. His tone in the message was tired, annoyed, and, honestly, condescending in that way that makes you feel like you are a teenager being lectured by a guidance counselor. He said his sister was really upset and that his parents were in shock, as if the person whose face had been slapped first was not sitting alone in our apartment listening to this. He said, "You should not have hit her back, Lana. That is not okay. I know she should not have hit you either. But you are older. You should have kept it together." I actually laughed when he said that. This bitter little sound that did not feel like it came from me. Older by what? A couple of years? And even if I had been 10 years older, how exactly does that make it okay for someone to hit me and not expect anything? He went on about how his sister was talking about pressing charges, about calling a lawyer, about not letting this go, and that his parents were supporting her. He said he was going to stay over there that night because she was a mess and they needed him. Then came the punchline, the part that really told me where I ranked in that hierarchy. It would help a lot if you apologized to her. Like, really apologized. Maybe we can avoid things getting ugly. I paused the message halfway through, walked around the living room in a circle, then pressed play again, as if hearing it a second time would make it sound different. It did not. He finished by saying he did not want to see this tear the family apart, that we needed to be reasonable, and that he loved me, but I had put him in a very difficult position. I love how people like to say, "You put me in a difficult position," when what they really mean is, "You forced me to show you where my loyalty actually is." I did not reply that night. I put my phone face down on the coffee table, turned off the lights, and lay on the couch instead of the bed, because somehow the bed felt too much like us, and I was not sure what us even meant anymore. I stared at the ceiling in the dark, thinking about how many tiny choices had led me here, from saying yes to that first date with him, to saying yes to moving in together, to saying yes to marrying into a family that had never truly accepted me as one of theirs. By morning, the part of me that always tries to make things work had already started drafting apology speeches in my head, while the other part, the one that had slapped back last night, sat in the corner with her arms crossed, glaring. The two halves fought while I packed a small overnight bag. I did not exactly plan it like a dramatic exit. It felt more like survival. I grabbed a few clothes, basic toiletries, my work laptop, important documents I did not want to leave lying around, and put them into 2 bags. I left a note on the kitchen table, not some cinematic goodbye letter, just a few lines saying I needed space and was going to stay with my parents for a bit. Then I called a ride again because I live in a country where public transportation exists mostly as a rumor in certain neighborhoods, and headed to my parents' place across town. My mother opened the door in pajamas, her hair pulled up, surprise all over her face when she saw the bags. "What happened?" she asked, turning immediately protective in that way she has, even before she knows the details. I told her I would explain inside, and once we were in the living room, she sat on the edge of the couch while I paced and spilled everything. The wine, the dress, the slap, the second slap, the way everyone had turned on me, the message from my husband. By the time I finished, my throat was raw and my mother looked like she was trying very hard not to go drive over to my mother-in-law's house and start her own war. "She hit you first," she kept repeating, like saying it enough times might make it matter to someone other than us. "And your husband did not defend you? Not once?" When I shook my head, my father, who had been listening from the hallway, came in with his jaw clenched. "I am calling him," he said, pulling his phone out. My mother put a hand on his arm and said, "Wait, you are angry." And he said, "Yes, I am angry. What of it?" He called anyway, because my father is not really a wait until you calm down kind of person when his kid is crying in front of him. I sat there listening to one side of the conversation. My father's voice hard as he told my husband that hitting me was unacceptable, that standing there while his sister hit me was unacceptable, that expecting me to grovel after being hit was, you guessed it, unacceptable. From the short pauses and my father's expressions, I could tell my husband was saying all the usual things on the other end, about not wanting to escalate, about family being complicated, about me overreacting. My father finally said, "She is staying here for now. We will talk about next steps when you are ready to take responsibility for your part in this," and hung up before my husband could respond. Later, when it was just me and my mother again, she sighed and said the thing mothers say when they are trying to be honest but gentle. "You know I never liked the way they treated you," she admitted. "I kept hoping it would get better after the wedding." I laughed at that, wiped my nose, and said, "Yeah, I kept hoping that too." Then, because I needed to hear it from someone else, I asked, "Do you think I was wrong to slap her back?" My mother hesitated, then said, "I think it was a mistake, but I also think people can only take so much. It does not make you some monster. It makes you human." At some point that afternoon, curiosity got the better of me, and I opened a search page on my phone, typing in things like "slap at family party assault" and "can someone press charges over slap if they hit first?" Because apparently this is what being an adult looks like now, Googling your potential legal exposure while sitting on your parents' couch. Most of what I found made me feel both better and worse. Better, because a single slap in a private setting with mutual contact is unlikely to end in anyone being thrown into a cell, especially when there are witnesses to the first hit. Worse, because the idea of my face and my name being dragged through any kind of formal process made my stomach twist. Rather than sit there waiting for my sister-in-law to make the next move, I made one of my own. I opened the same payment app my husband's family loved to use to split dinner bills and send requests for $5 here and $10 there, and I looked up my sister-in-law's profile. I checked a few listings for similar designer dresses, almost choked when I saw the price range, and then sent an amount high enough that nobody could accuse me of pretending it was a cheap fix, plus extra for cleaning. In the note I typed, "For the dress from last night. I am paying for the damage. That is all I owe you." It felt petty and generous at the same time, which is a very weird combination. But at least it meant if she tried to claim I destroyed her property and did nothing, I could prove otherwise. Money cannot fix the fact that someone slapped you across the face in front of a room full of people, but at least it can close one small door of argument. Over the next couple of days, the fallout really started to show in all the boring practical places. Starting with the card I used for household expenses, the one under his name, with me as an authorized user that we had always treated as our default household card, suddenly not going through anywhere. I found out at the grocery store, which is always a fun and not at all humiliating place to discover your financial wings have been clipped. I had to pull out my own personal card, which I use mostly for emergencies, while the cashier politely pretended not to notice the declined message on the screen. When I called the company later, they told me my husband had removed me as an authorized user. No warning, no discussion, just good luck paying for things on your own while we decide whether you are worthy. Then there were the messages. My mother-in-law wrote a long one about how disappointed she was in me, how she had opened her home to me, and this was how I repaid her. How, in our family, we do not solve problems with violence. I read that part 3 times, staring at it like maybe the words would rearrange themselves into something honest. Like, in our family, we allow our favorite child to hit whoever she wants without consequences. One of my husband's cousins, who had been at the party, sent a shorter message saying she did not want to take sides, but it really did not look good when I slapped back. I typed and deleted several responses before settling on, "You saw her hit me first, right?" And the cousin replied with a weak, "Yeah, but she was drunk and upset. It was an accident." That word, accident, made me laugh in that hysterical way that is not really about humor. My wine spill had been an accident. Her hand connecting with my face had not been an accident. You do not accidentally wind up with your palm on someone's cheek with enough force to leave a mark. But sure, let us call that an accident and my reaction a crime. The kicker was the family group chat. I watched the little notifications trickle in over the next mornings and nights, messages flying back and forth between their names, all of them talking as if I was not even there. Every time I tried to respond, to clarify, to say anything, the chat went quiet until I stopped typing, and then they went back to discussing their weekends, their plans, some new recipe my mother-in-law was trying. They basically ghosted me in a chat I could still see, which takes a special kind of cruel. There was a moment in all of that where I thought, maybe I should just apologize. Maybe that would calm everything down. Maybe I can live with pretending I was fully at fault if it means not having my whole life explode. It is wild what we are willing to consider when we are scared of being alone. But then I remembered my husband's message. The way he had said I had put him in a difficult position, and something in me solidified. I called a lawyer, not a fancy one, not someone that charges by the minute in a glass tower, just a regular attorney who handles divorces and simple disputes, whose office is in a plain building with a faded sign. I told him what had happened, the slap, the threats about pressing charges, the sudden money games, and I asked what my options actually looked like, not through the lens of my husband's family drama, but through the law. He listened, asked questions, took notes, and then told me a few straightforward things. 1. If my sister-in-law tried to file a complaint, the fact that she hit me first and there were witnesses to that would matter. 2. Using shared finances as a way to punish or control a spouse is not a good look for my husband if things did go to court. 3. If I wanted to separate, I did not have to ask anyone's permission. And given that we did not have kids or complicated assets, it could be legally simple, even if emotionally messy. Walking out of that office, I felt both terrified and strangely powerful. And for what it is worth, the whole pressing charges thing started shrinking the second I stopped sobbing and started acting like an adult about it. I wrote down dates, saved screenshots of those messages, kept the payment receipt for the dress money, noted who had been in the room, and then refused to answer anything that was just bait. People calm down fast when they realize you are keeping records. And that, more than any speech, shook something loose in my brain. A week and a half after the slap, my husband texted me asking if we could meet in person to talk. I agreed, because I am not a fan of ending entire marriages over text, tempting as it may be. We chose a neutral coffee shop halfway between my parents' place and our apartment. When I walked in, he was already there, sitting at a table with 2 cups in front of him, 1 black coffee for him, 1 something sweet with foam for me, like he always ordered when we were still good. For a second, my chest hurt with nostalgia, but then I remembered why we were there. He looked tired, which good, because so was I. We did the awkward small talk thing for about 30 seconds before I said, "So, your sister." He sighed like a man who has been through a hard week at some noble job instead of a man whose wife got slapped at a party. "She is still really upset," he said. "She keeps talking about the dress, about how you humiliated her in front of everyone." "I humiliated her," I repeated slowly, because sometimes you have to savor the absurdity before you swallow it. "She slapped me first, in front of everyone. I humiliated her by not just taking it quietly." He ran a hand through his hair, that nervous habit he has, and said, "I am not saying she was right to hit you. She was drunk, she was emotional, but you could have walked away. You are the adult in the room." "I am not her babysitter," I snapped, louder than I meant to, and a couple of people at nearby tables glanced over. "I am not responsible for managing your grown sister's emotions, so she does not commit assault in the living room. I am your wife. Or I was, depending on how this conversation goes." Saying that out loud made his face flinch, just a little. He took a breath, like he was gearing up for some negotiation. "Look, my parents are freaking out. They say they do not feel comfortable having you over if things are like this. My sister says she will not come to any family events if you are there. They are talking about, like, cutting me off if I do not stand with them on this." He paused like he expected me to be moved by the horror of him potentially missing out on Sunday dinners. "I do not want that. I do not want to be estranged from my family." There it was, the real fear talking. Not fear of losing me, not fear of what this had done to our relationship, but fear of being the son who disappointed mommy and daddy. I leaned back in my chair and looked at him. Really looked, maybe more clearly than I ever had. "So what do you want?" I asked. "I want you to apologize to my sister," he said, as if he had not heard a single thing I had said for the last 10 minutes. "Like, really apologize. In person. Show her you regret what you did. My parents think if you do that, she will drop this whole idea of going to a lawyer. We can move on. We can fix this." "And does she apologize to me?" I asked. "For slapping me, for screaming at me, for dragging my job into it, for calling me careless and poor in front of everyone?" He hesitated for a fraction of a second and then said, "She was drunk, Lana. She does not even remember exactly how it happened. She feels like you embarrassed her on purpose. There is something about being told to be the bigger person by someone standing comfortably on the low ground that makes your blood boil." I laughed quietly because otherwise I might have screamed. "Taking the high road does not mean letting people wipe their feet on me," I said. "You know that, right? Or have you lived in that house so long you think that is just how things work?" He bristled, the way he always did when I criticized his family, even indirectly. You always make it about them, he said. You never try to see it from their side. They think you do not like them either. As if liking someone and letting them smack you across the face and then demand an apology are in the same category of compromise. I could feel the conversation shifting inside me like a train switching tracks. A week ago, maybe even 2 days ago, I might have been more willing to bend, to find some middle ground, to offer some half apology like, I am sorry things got out of hand, just to keep everyone else comfortable. But sitting there, after everything, I realized that every piece I had been keeping had come at the cost of my own self-respect. I went to see a lawyer, I said, watching his expression carefully. His eyes widened a little, and he sat up straighter. Not because I am planning some big dramatic lawsuit, because I needed to know where I stand. Legally, financially. I needed to know if I am actually trapped here, or if that is just something your family wants me to believe. You went to a lawyer? He repeated, like I had just told him I had joined a cult. Why would you do that without talking to me first? I raised my eyebrows. You removed me from the credit card without talking to me first. You stayed at your parents' house without talking to me first. You told me I needed to apologize to the person who hit me without talking to me about how that made me feel. So forgive me if I did not feel like I had a partner to consult before figuring out how to protect myself. He opened his mouth, closed it, then said, So what? You want a divorce now? There was this mixture of disbelief and theatrical hurt in his voice, like the very idea offended him on a personal level. And in that moment, I realized that yes, actually, I did. I think I do, I said, surprising myself only in how calm I sounded. Because I cannot keep doing this. I cannot keep walking into rooms where I am the only one expected to take every hit, literal or not, for the sake of family harmony. I cannot be married to someone whose first instinct when I get slapped is to ask me to say sorry. He stared at me for what felt like a very long time. Then he shook his head like he could just reject my reality and substitute his own. You are overreacting, he said. This is one fight, one bad night. You are going to throw away our whole marriage over a slap? Over a pattern, I corrected. Over years of you letting them disrespect me. Over you always choosing the path of least resistance, which just happens to be the path where I am the one bending. Over you punishing me financially instead of having an adult conversation. Over you being more afraid of your mother's disappointment than of your wife walking out. He flinched at that, looked away, stared at the table. The coffee between us had gone cold. I felt a weird detachment watching him, like I was outside my own body, looking at this scene from above. Girl sits in coffee shop. Boy begs her not to blow things out of proportion. Girl realizes the proportion has been wrong for a very long time. I am not signing anything, he said eventually, because he is the kind of person who thinks refusing paperwork can stop reality. I will not agree to this. You cannot just make a decision like that on your own. I almost smiled, because in a twisted way, that was classic him, believing that if he did not cooperate, nothing could move forward. Actually, I said, I can. You do not have to agree for me to file. This is not one of those situations. We do not have kids. We do not have a house together. The law is not going to chain me to you because you do not feel like letting go. He stared at me with something like fear in his eyes. Or maybe it was just the realization that his default strategy of doing nothing until I gave up was not going to work this time. So that is it? He asked. You are just done? I thought about our early days, the nights eating cheap takeout, the way he used to make me laugh, the way we used to talk about building a life where we had each other's backs. Then I thought about the sound of his sister's hand on my face, the echo of his voice saying I needed to apologize, the emptiness of our apartment the night he chose to stay with them instead of coming home. Yeah, I said softly. I think I am. I did not storm out dramatically. I finished my cold coffee, stood up, told him my lawyer would be in touch, and walked out into the bright afternoon like I was just another person leaving a coffee shop, not someone stepping out of a marriage. The sun felt weirdly harsh on my skin, and for a second I wanted to cry, collapse, call him back. Instead, I kept walking. The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork and awkward conversations and that strange mix of grief and relief that comes with endings. We did the awkward box swap too. Me grabbing my clothes and documents, him taking his tools, and whatever else still felt like hours. And it was exactly as romantic as it sounds. My husband sent me long messages about how I was making a mistake, how we could go to counseling, how his sister was willing to move on if I apologized. I ignored most of them, only replying with practical answers about signing documents or returning his things. My mother-in-law tried her own tactics. She called my mother to tell her I was destroying her son's life, conveniently skipping over the part where her daughter had tried to destroy my face. She sent me messages about how marriage was about sacrifice, about how she had put up with plenty of things from her own husband for the sake of family, like that was a model I should aspire to. I wrote one long response that I never sent, explaining that sacrificing your basic dignity is not the same as compromising on what show to watch after dinner. The divorce itself was, like the lawyer had predicted, not some epic courtroom scene, just a slow grind of forms, signatures, and waiting periods. Where we live there is this built-in stretch of time you have to sit with the decision, like the state wants to be really sure you mean it before a judge signs off. So it all took a few months of back and forth. No kids, no house in both our names, no dramatic fight over furniture meant that once the clock finally ran out, it was mostly a matter of a clerk stamping things and a judge spending maybe 5 minutes looking at the file before moving on to the next couple who had thought forever would be easier than it turned out to be. After it was officially done, I walked outside and felt, not free exactly, but lighter, like someone had loosened a too tight belt around my chest. My mother met me on the sidewalk with a hug and a sandwich she had picked up on the way because she knows grief makes me forget to eat. We sat on a bench and she asked how I felt, and I told her the truth, which was tired, sad, and weirdly proud of myself. A few weeks after the papers were signed, my sister-in-law's husband sent me a message asking if he could drop something off. He showed up looking more wrung out than angry, handed me a small box of snacks and a card, and said he had moved out for a while after another explosion at their house. He told me a counselor had made him replay that night in the living room, and that the more he thought about it, the more it bothered him that everyone had expected me to just stand there and take it. He said he was sorry for staying quiet and wanted me to hear at least one person from that side say it was wrong. I believed him, and it did help, but I still did not invite him in. I was done being the unofficial emotional sponge for that household. Life did not instantly become some empowering montage after that. I still had to work every day, answering phones and scheduling appointments at the medical office. Still had to pay rent on the small apartment I eventually moved into on my own. Still had nights where I lay awake replaying the good moments of my marriage and wondering if I had pulled the plug too soon. But then I would remember that party. The slap, the way his fingers dug into my arm as he told me I had made things worse. And the doubt would quiet down. Months later, his name popped up on my phone. The text said, "Hi, Lana. Do you have a minute?" For a second I thought, what fresh drama is this? But curiosity won again, and I replied, "What is going on?" He asked if he could call, said it was easier to explain by voice, and against my better judgment, I agreed. His voice sounded tired and older than I remembered, like the last few months had aged him. He apologized immediately, not for himself at first, but for his wife. He said, "I should have stepped in that night. I saw what happened. I saw her hit you first. I let everyone pretend it had been the other way around because it was easier." He told me that things between them had gotten worse since the party, that the girl who had slapped me had slapped other people too, not always literally, but with words, with behaviors. That her anger, which everyone had always brushed off as just her personality, had started spilling over in ways he could not ignore. He said he had moved out for a while after a particularly bad fight, that he was staying with a friend, that he had started seeing a counselor who was helping him understand how long he had been enabling her behavior. He mentioned, almost as an aside, that they had been trying to get pregnant for a while and it had not been working, and that his wife was spiraling about it, blaming herself, blaming him, blaming the world. I could hear in his voice that he felt guilty even bringing that up to me, like he knew there was a part of the old me that might have softened at that and said, "Oh, that is so hard." I will be honest with you, I did not feel much sympathy. I know that makes me sound cold, but it is hard to dig up compassion for someone who saw your face as an acceptable place to land their frustration. He said, "I know you probably do not care about any of this, and you have every right not to. I just needed to say I am sorry for not speaking up, for letting you be the villain in a story where you were not the only one at fault." He also said something that stuck with me. "Your leaving shook them more than they will ever admit. They thought you would swallow it. They always think people will swallow it." I thanked him for the apology. I told him that, honestly, it had been a long time since I had spent energy thinking about that house or the people in it. That was not entirely true, but it felt true enough that day. I told him I hoped he figured out what he needed to do to be okay, and that I was not the right person to give him advice. We hung up after that, two people sitting in different parts of the same city, connected only by the ghost of a family dinner gone wrong. Sometimes, when I am alone in my little apartment, eating takeout on the couch and watching some show where characters forgive each other a little too easily, I think about that night again. I think about the way my hand stung after I slapped her back, about the look on my husband's face when I told him I wanted a divorce, about my mother's arms around me in the living room, about the lawyer's matter-of-fact voice saying I was not trapped. I do not feel proud of the slap itself. Violence is not something I want to be part of my self-image. But I am proud that I finally stopped treating myself like the only one who had to absorb impact for the sake of not making waves. People love to say, it is just family. Like that explains everything. Like being related to someone gives them unlimited access to your boundaries. What I have learned, what I am still learning, is that family is just people. People who can be kind or cruel, selfish or generous, loving or awful. And I get to decide, for the first time in a long time, which people I let into my life and which ones only exist anymore as characters in a story I tell to remind myself that I did not imagine it, that it really happened, that I really walked away. And because life does not stop just because one story ends, there were still bills to pay, shifts to cover, appointments to schedule, laundry to do, all the boring little things that keep you tethered to the planet when part of you feels like you should have gotten some dramatic soundtrack and a fade to black. Instead, I had fluorescent lights at the medical office and a sticky desk phone that always rang at the worst possible moment, and a manager who thought being 5 minutes late from lunch meant I was on the brink of spiraling into chaos. The first day I went back to work after the divorce was finalized, my coworker looked at me over the edge of her computer monitor and said, "You look different." I asked if that was code for, "You look like you have been crying in your car." But she shook her head and said, "No, like lighter or something. Did you get a haircut?" I had not. I just was not carrying an entire extended family on my shoulders anymore. I shrugged and said, "Paperwork got signed," which is not the most poetic way to describe the end of a marriage, but it was the truth. There were still moments where the old patterns tried to creep back in. A patient yelled at me once because their insurance did not cover something, and they decided the person picking up the phone must have direct control over national health policy. The old me would have apologized 100 times and gone home feeling like I had personally failed them. The slightly newer me took a breath, kept my voice calm, and said, "I understand you are frustrated, but do not speak to me like that. I am trying to help you." My hands were shaking a little, but I did it. Later in the break room, I laughed with my coworker about how I had just drawn a line with a stranger more easily than I ever had with my own ex-husband's mother. On weekends, I went to my parents' house for dinner a lot more. My mother would make something that reminded me of childhood. My father would insist on sending me home with leftovers in plastic containers that multiplied in my fridge, and we would talk about everything and nothing. Sometimes an aunt or cousin would be there, and somebody would inevitably ask, in that nosy but loving way, "Have you heard from him?" Meaning my ex. I would say yes or no depending on the week, and there would be a round of clucking tongues and a few jokes about him regretting it when he realized what he had lost. But nobody ever told me I should have stayed, that I should have tried harder to make his family like me. One night, my uncle made a comment at the table about how marriage is hard, but you have to endure it. And for a second, I felt that old sting, like maybe I had failed some test. Then I looked around and saw my parents watching me, not with judgment, but with this quiet support, and I said, "There is a difference between working through problems and letting people treat you like you are disposable. I am done with the second thing." The table went a little quiet. Then my aunt raised her glass and said, "Amen to that." And the conversation moved on. Nobody banned me from their house. Nobody told me I had made things worse. It was such a small, normal moment, but it felt like a tiny repair in my brain. Every now and then, late at night when my brain wanted something to chew on, I would type in their names and scroll. I saw pictures from birthdays and holidays, my ex smiling with his arm around his sister, my mother-in-law's captions about family first, and nothing more important than being together. Sometimes I would feel this weird hollow ache in my chest, like I had been cut out of a photograph and the outline was still there. Other times I would roll my eyes so hard I thought they might get stuck. One post in particular stuck with me for days. It was a picture of my sister-in-law in another white dress, not quite as dramatic as the one from that night, but close. The caption was something like, "Some people try to bring you down, but you just keep shining," with a little line about true elegance cannot be ruined. It did not mention me by name, obviously, but I could feel the subtext all the way through the screen. I stared at it for a long moment, thumb hovering over the block button, and then I put my phone down and went to wash the dishes instead. The next morning, I finally muted all of them. Not blocked, because a tiny petty part of me still wanted to know if any of them ever posted something like, "Remember that time we were all wrong?" But muted, because I did not need their curated life cropping up between videos of pets and recipes every time I tried to relax. Therapy helped too, even though I went in half skeptical at first. I sat on a couch in a small office that smelled like tea and old books, across from a woman who asked me questions that made me feel both seen and uncomfortably exposed. She asked about my marriage, of course, but also about my childhood, about how conflict was handled in my family growing up, about who was allowed to be angry and who was told to be the bigger person. Turns out I had been training for this role long before I married into that family. We talked about the way I used jokes to diffuse tension, how often I apologized for things that were not my fault, how quick I was to believe that if someone was unhappy, it must somehow be because I had failed them. At one point, she said, "It sounds like you learned that smoothing things over was your job." And I laughed and said, "Congratulations, you have just met the employee of the month." I cried in that office more times than I would like to admit, but I also laughed. And slowly, session by session, the slap became a moment in a larger pattern instead of the defining drama of my life. My ex did reach out again, more than once. The messages shifted over time. At first they were angry, accusing, full of lines about how I had overreacted and ruined everything. Then they got softer, more pleading, telling me he missed me, reminding me of our early days, promising his family was willing to start fresh. He never used the words, "I was wrong," though. Not once did he say, "I should have defended you." It was always, "We all made mistakes," in that vague way that spreads blame around, until nobody has to actually hold it. One afternoon, months after the divorce, he called instead of texting. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in me wanted to hear what his voice sounded like now. He sounded tired, stressed, and for a second, my heart did that little nostalgic twist again, remembering late nights when we were broke and laughing and in love. Then he said, "Things have been really rough since you left," and not in a "my eyes are opened" way, more in a "I want to vent to you about the family you escaped" way. He told me his sister had gotten into a bad fight with their mother over something small that had turned big, that she had thrown a glass against the wall, that their father had finally yelled back instead of babying her, that the house had turned into a war zone for a week. "Sometimes I think you leaving started all this," he said. And for a second I almost took that as blame, until I realized there was another way to hear it. "Maybe me leaving just meant nobody was there to absorb it for them anymore," I said. There was a pause on the line, long enough for me to wonder if he had hung up. Then he sighed and said, "Maybe." It was the closest he ever came to acknowledging what my role had been in that mess. He asked if we could meet, just to talk, just as friends, just to get closure. I told him gently but firmly that my closure had come in the form of a stack of signed papers and a life I was patching together without him. "I hope you figure your stuff out," I said. "I really do. But I cannot be the person who listens to you complain about the house I used to be emotionally trapped in. That is not fair to either of us." He sounded hurt, but he did not fight me on it. We said goodbye. I hung up and sat on my couch staring at the blank television screen for a while, letting the quiet settle around me. Then I got up, made myself some dinner, and put on a show that had nothing to do with family drama, just people baking elaborate cakes and being nice to each other for a change. The first big holiday season after the divorce was strange and a little raw. I had spent so many years splitting time between my parents' house and my in-laws' house, juggling schedules, trying not to offend anyone with whose table I sat at and for how long. Suddenly, I had exactly one place to be, and there was a certain relief in that. No frantic clock watching, no forced smiles in living rooms where people wanted me to shrink, just my parents, a couple of relatives, and me. On Thanksgiving, my mother brought out a bottle of red wine and raised an eyebrow at me with a tiny, mischievous smile. "You sure you are okay with this?" she asked, waving it like a prop. "We can keep it away from white dresses." I burst out laughing. Real laughter this time, not the brittle kind. "As long as nobody slaps anyone," I said. "I think we are good." My father, who had been unusually quiet about the specifics of the slap beyond his initial anger, reached over and squeezed my hand. "Nobody is slapping my kid in my house," he said. "If they try, they can see themselves back out the door." It was such a simple sentence, but it hit me right in the chest. The younger version of me, the one who had tried so hard to earn that kind of protection from my ex's family, felt seen in a way she never had over there. Little by little, the story of that night shifted in my own mind. At first, it had been this horrible thing that happened to me, all capital letters. Then it became the night everything blew up. Then slowly it became just one chapter in a longer story of learning to stop making myself smaller so other people could feel big. I started telling the story differently when friends asked, less like a confession and more like a case study in what happens when you finally say enough. There were still messy parts, of course. Dating again was weird. The first time I went out with someone new, I spent the whole time waiting for him to ask about my family, about my ex, about what had happened. When he did, I gave him the short version, watching his face carefully for any sign of, "Wow, you sound like the problem." Instead, he said, "Damn, that sounds rough. Good for you for getting out," and then asked me what kind of music I liked. I almost cried into my drink out of sheer relief. Walking away did not turn me into some shiny new version overnight. Most of what came after looked boring. Work, laundry, calling my mother, therapy sessions picking apart years of me saying, "It is fine," when it was not. Some mornings I missed the idea of my old life, until I remembered that slap and the way nobody moved until I hit back. Little things started changing first. I stopped automatically volunteering for every awkward family obligation on my side. I stopped answering messages from my former in-laws, even the neutral ones. I learned to let other people sit in the silence they created instead of rushing to fill it with apologies. I still slip up, still catch myself rehearsing explanations in my head for decisions that do not actually need a committee vote. But now there is this louder part of me that goes, "No, we are not doing that again." And I listen to her more than I used to. If there is a point to all of this, it is probably smaller than people like to make it. It is not about never spilling wine or avoiding certain kinds of families, even if both sound tempting. It is about the moment you realize that staying quiet has never once protected you from being hurt. It just made it easier for everyone else to pretend they did not see it. The night I got slapped in that living room and finally slapped back did not make me a hero, but it did rip open the neat little story I had been telling myself about what I had to tolerate. Leaving finished what that moment started. Now, when I walk into my own place and drop my keys on the table, there is nobody waiting to see how much I am willing to swallow to keep the peace. Some days that feels lonely. Most days it feels like air.